Hello, hello. I want to teach you today how to make a loose, easy watercolor sunflower. I feel like sunflowers are one of those things that are appearing really intimidating, but actually at the end of the day, it's just piecing different shapes together. And so we're gonna go over how to paint a loose sunflower today. We are going to also add a little bit of fun at the end to get a little bit of texture in there and have a little bit of fun experimenting. If you are not comfortable painting leaves, I recommend you take my Easy Watercolor Leaves tutorial because we will kind of be using some of the foundation that I established in that tutorial for building up the sunflower. But if you don't want to take that, you don't need it. It's not a prerequisite for taking this tutorial. So let's go ahead and paint a sunflower. All right, hello and welcome to this loose sunflower watercolor tutorial. We are going to be painting something that looks somewhat like this. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. I wanted to just have this here for you guys to see generally what we're creating today. So when I'm working with sunflowers, the first thing that I want to consider is the center of the flower. And in the center, I am going to begin with a darker brown color. And darker because it's usually more dense with the seeds in the center of the flower. So I often like to come in with just a little bit of a darker brown there, and then around it, I will be able to do any kind of lighter color. And I'm making sure I have some good water on my brush, but trying not to oversaturate it too much. And then I will come in around it with a slightly lighter brown. At this point, it will probably just kind of all blur together and look pretty similar and pretty much the same, but I want you to just kind of keep this in mind that the center part is going to be darker ultimately. While the center is still brown, I'm going to come in with some yellow on my paintbrush. It can be a bright yellow, orange yellow, kind of whatever color you're going for, as long as it's within that yellow family. And we start where we barely touch the center and we pull out, pushing down with a little bit more pressure on our brush and lifting up. Now, since we're going for a more loose watercolor feel, I'm going to come in with some more yellow on my brush and really kind of dab that in there so that there's different layers of paint throughout. That allows this kind of loose feel to it, as does this pulling of the paint from the center. Coming with our next petal, I'm going to come right next to the center, but I'm not going to touch it this time because I don't want this brown to be pulled into all the petals. Well, I touched it, so never mind. We'll do that on the next one. I want some variation though in my petals. So what I'm doing here is a very foundational stroke that I taught in my Easy Watercolor Leaves tutorial, where it's changing the pressure on the brush, and that is what is changing the shape that is showing up on the page. So starting with a lighter touch to get the tip of the brush and that thinner stroke, pushing down on the pressure for the body of the petal, widens it and makes it a thicker body, and then you can lift up and it gets thinner again as you go along. Now I'm going to come in with a slightly darker yellow, just kind of tap it in here while the brighter yellow I have on here is still wet. If I had started with a darker yellow, I would come in with a brighter yellow. It doesn't really matter. And ultimately I'll be coming in with probably a more orangey yellow anyway, but just to start that blending process of the watercolor leaves and to get that kind of watercolor feel. All right. So I've come in here and I'm going to come and start doing the back of this sunflower, which is tilted a little bit. So I'm going to make shorter leaves in the back because as something is facing us head on, it's going to be pretty uniform in the length of its leaves. But as it tilts away from us, we see the front leaves longer than the back leaves. Sorry, I keep saying leaves, petals, but we'll see the front petals longer than the back petals. And so as we're painting the petals in the back of the sunflower, we are going to make them shorter. We're also going to make them probably a little less pointy because the petals are tilted back in such a way that we may not see the very ends of them. And to make them less pointy, we're coming in and just pulling up faster as opposed to in this front where we're really kind of elongating that end part where we were pulling up on our pressure. We are going to come in, push down almost immediately, and lift up more quickly. That gives us a shorter and wider view here. Come over here. And as we start coming up to the front, we can start making it long again. Now, sunflowers are generally pretty dense, so I'm going to come in and just add a couple more petals here. You may not necessarily see them very clearly defined as they're touching each other, but having the separations at the ends helps show where the petals are for the viewer. And generally with this kind of loose or looser watercolor flower, we are going to have a little bit less of that really clear definition of where everything is and how things fall. And that's part of the kind of appeal of that looseness of a watercolor piece. Now at this point, while the petals are still wet, I'm going to come in with almost like a bright orange, like a golden orange, but whatever color you have, I just want to start adding a little bit of other color near the center of this flower. And I'm going to be dropping it in to the yellow and kind of flicking it outwards so that I'm helping promote which direction the watercolor starts flowing. When you drop watercolor into water, it obviously, of course, starts kind of moving outwards and moving where the water is. And if there's water in two directions, for instance, the center part still is not completely dry, but I don't necessarily want the yellow to only go into the center. So when I'm dropping it in and I'm kind of moving it or flicking it outwards, I am helping kind of promote the movement of it in the direction that I want it to go. And while it's still wet also, I'm going to come in with my green for the stem. Now, I'm not going to draw a stem on top of my flowers, but I am going to sort of hover above where I want the stem to generally be coming from. And if it's tilted and kind of facing that way, I come down to this sort of center area and I'm going to just kind of float over where I would put it were I to paint it on top of them, and then place my brush down when I hit the white part down here. And I'm going to not touch the yellow a lot here because were I to pull the paint down from the yellow petals, that would give the appearance that it's kind of coming directly out from where the petals are. But in fact, this is coming from behind the petals and the petals are not really anywhere near it. And so to give that kind of perspective of it popping up above where this is, I want to make sure they're not blending together too much. A lot of the times I do want them to blend together because it creates a really beautiful watercolor illusion, but in this instant, that is not what I'm going for. So I'm just going to pull some of this watercolor paint up. I just cleaned my brush off and came in with a clean, mostly dry-ish brush, meaning it's not saturated, but it's still damp because I've been using it. And that's just because I put too much paint down on the page there. And we are going to start with a petal. And I do go over in my easy watercolor leaves tutorial all the ins and outs of ways to build really easy leaves. But we are going to come out from the stem, put our pressure down on our brush to build that body shape and lift up. And from here, we're just going to start building shapes off of the petal itself. And I'm just doing the same motion over and over again, just giving it kind of different directions to build the shape of the petal that I want. Sorry, the leaf. I do this all the time. Leaves, petals, I confuse it in every class. And I'm also going to come in and just pull up some paint here, just to add a little bit of dimension. Then I can come in and do the leaf on the other side. When I'm painting leaves on the opposite side of the hand that I'm using, so I'm right-handed, so it'd be leaves in the left side of the stem. I find it really hard to come from the stem and go out. It's very smudgy and I can't see what I'm doing. So I tend to start from the outer edge of the leaf, and I just do the exact same motion, starting with the tip, pushing down to get the body, and then lifting up that pressure on the brush. And just like on the other side, we're just going to build the shape by doing that exact same motion over and over again within the body of this leaf. I will lift up some paint at the top to build a little dimension there as well. All right, so at this point, I'm going to come in and add a slightly different color into my leaves. I never like to put just one color down in a painting, in any one part of the painting. Even if it's a really subtle color shift, having an additional color in there is going to help bring some movement into your painting in a way that's going to really draw your audience in and draw the eye in and keep it from looking and feeling really flat. Now I smudged a little bit down here, so I could come in and try to lift that and erase. But I think for the sake of this, I'm going to actually just do a tiny little leaf that comes up and is kind of on its side, so it doesn't have to be very big and it's not flat in front of me. It's more on its side and tilted, so I can make it a narrower leaf. And then I'm going to come back up to the center here of my flower where a lot of this has dried and now I can see how uniform it's looking. And I'm just going to add a little bit more darkness in the center. And because I want this to be a looser feeling painting, I'm actually, instead of coming in and creating marks with watercolor to note where all the seeds might be in there and the texture, I'm actually going to come in. I just like to keep some salt on my desk. And I'm going to come in with just a tiny bit of salt and just drop that directly over the center. And as it dries, it pulls up some of the pigment of the watercolor, and then you end up with this really nifty little texture. And it's a really beautiful way, I think, of adding some texture to your painting without overwhelming it or without coming in and kind of taking away from that really loose feel that you have. And I'm just going to come in with just a little bit more orange just to add some more dimension, and adding the darker version of whatever color this leaf petal is from the center, to note that from the center in the center you're gonna have the most shadow. So I like to put my darkest colors near the center of the flower because the center of the flower is going to be kind of affecting how it looks in terms of casting a shadow on the stems, or casting a shadow on the petals. And I'm actually just going to do a couple little bits of salt in the leaves too, because it's a fun texture and I like it. And I'm going to create a center line by using the end of my paintbrush. While my paint is still wet, I'm just coming in and adding a very subtle center line to these leaves to give them also a little bit of dimension. And I'm just going to add a couple little shading leaves into my petals as well. I'm just using really light pressure on the base of my brush here. And it works best if it's still wet. So I'm coming primarily into the petals that still have water, just creating a little bit of dimension there. And then the last thing that I really want to do in here is some paint splatter. So I'm going to get my paintbrush nice and wet, pick up a good amount of paint. And when I'm doing paint splatter with flowers, I like to think of doing it in the color of like pollen, or the pollen that you might think is coming from here. If it was primarily a purple flower, I might do purple pollen. And I try to do it in the direction that the flower is facing. So just holding your paintbrush with water and pigment about an inch or two above the page horizontally, you just tap. And the more water you have on your paintbrush, the more, the bigger your splatters are going to be. And then I just do one or two down below. And to me, this gives the effect of almost like a flower blowing in the wind kind of feel to it. And I like that feeling of the wind is coming, it's moving it along, it's feeling, you know, a little bit more dense, and it's really starting to move on the page almost. And I actually think, now that I'm looking at this, I'm gonna add maybe just one more stroke in here, make that petal a little bigger. Try to get rid of some of this white space to make it a more dense sunflower. All right, and that's it. Let it dry, and once it's dried, you can scrape off the salt just by rubbing on top of your painting with a finger or a brush. Just make sure your hands are clean. Rub it around on there, and then you can toss the salt in the trash. And there you have it, a very easy, loose watercolor sunflower. Hey guys, it's me again, Isa. If you liked this tutorial, make sure you subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Tell me something you loved about the class. Feel free to ask me some questions, but definitely subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future tutorials. See you next time.